Welcome to the October session of the Lifelong Learning Women's Forum here at Pepperdine. My name is Vanessa John. I am the Cultural Attaché at Pepperdine's Graduate School of Education and Psychology, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today. I also send greetings from our benefactor and founder of Lifelong Learning. She's also an alum of GSEP, Kathy Donhockle. So this was something that was put on her heart to bring women together in a space where we could learn from one another and learn together to ask questions and to broaden our awareness. So we are definitely going to partake in that today. With that, Dr. Aguiberry, I hand it over to you.
And it's now my pleasure to introduce our honored guest, Dr. Mary Mullen. Dr. Mary Mullen is an accomplished professor, author, Fulbright, and Whitman Scholar. At Pepperdine, she is the Blanche E. Seaver Chair of English Literature, where she teaches American literature and culture, as well as social action and justice. As a Fulbright Scholar, Dr. Mullins taught at Tokyo Christian Women's University, as well as Tokyo Gakuke University. That's a tongue twister there. Her primary research interest is Walt Whitman, and Dr. Mullins' essays on Walt Whitman have appeared in many scholar journals. She recently published a book that gives a rare glimpse into the life of Walt Whitman's sister through her letters to her family, and it's titled Hannah Whitman Heyde, The Complete Correspondence. It was published by Bucknell, and much of what we hear today will come from that book and research. Please join me in welcoming our honored speaker, Dr. Marie Mullins.
Thank you so much, Yolanda, for that wonderful introduction, and it's so nice to meet you. Thank you also, Vanessa. I really appreciate all the work you've put into this. It's been just such a delight to work with you, and I am also very happy to be here, part of this series, which I have attended and admired for many years. So thank you so much. In addition, I also want to thank Pepperdine, because Pepperdine has supported this project through funding, especially Vice Provost Lee Katz and Katie Carr. My editor at Bucknell University Press, Suzanne Guiad, has also been very helpful, and her team really did a terrific job in producing this book and helping me to get Hannah's story out there. So finally, I'd like to thank my family, my sisters, my mom, my daughters, my colleagues, and my friends, some of whom are here today. And without your support, I don't think I could have continued with this project. So I really appreciate your support. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen so that you can start to get a look at some of my slides. I want you to see some of the letters themselves in Hannah's handwriting, but also to help you to get a deeper insight into her story. Hannah Whitman Heyde, her life story, her letters, and why an understanding of her biography and her correspondence gives us deeper insight into 19th century American culture, literature, and history. Born in Brooklyn, Hannah was the second daughter and fourth child of Louisa Van Velser Whitman and Walter Whitman. These are their daguerreotypes here in front of you. And aside from her younger brother, Jeff, Hannah may have been the most beloved of all the Whitman siblings. Prior to her marriage at the age of 28 to the Vermont landscape painter, Charles Louis Heyde, Hannah lived at home with the Whitman family. Her letters reveal that she was close to all the members of her family, but especially to her mother, Louisa, and to her older brother, Walt, perhaps one of the most famous American poets. Before her marriage, Hannah was described as a bright, laughing girl with a tremendous zest for living. Cheerful, industrious, creative, and tender-hearted, Hannah had a special talent for sewing. She sewed dresses for herself, shirts for her brothers, and later also made shirts for her husband and sheets and pillowcases for their living quarters. Soon after her marriage and her move to Vermont, Hannah disclosed in her letters to her mother that she had become the target of her husband's escalating verbal, emotional, and physical abuse. While many of her letters are missing or were destroyed, there is enough evidence in the letters that remain to provide deeper insight into Hannah's situation and into intimate partner violence in 19th century America. Relatively penniless, isolated, and abused for decades, Hannah nevertheless recorded her experiences in the letters she wrote to her mother and to her brother Walt. The letter you see there on the right is from her brother Walt, and he continued to be one of her most important correspondents. The recovery of her voice is vital to a full understanding of Walt Whitman's work, but also to a wider understanding of intimate partner violence in 19th century America, as well as the status of women. Reading her letters deepens our understanding of his relationship, Walt Whitman's relationships with family members. And in these letters, which range in length from 4 to 12 pages, Hannah tells her own story. She writes privately about her experiences, and her letter writing served as a refuge for her, but also as temporary relief and as an escape from the abuse she experienced during the 40 years of her marriage. The only known image of Hannah is this daguerreotype, which Bridget and I visited in Camden, New Jersey at the Walt Whitman House. I uncovered that it had been in the vault. It was a whole nother story. But this daguerreotype was probably taken in the mid to late 1850s, shortly after her father's death, Walter Whitman Sr. He died in 1855. In a letter to her brother Walt, Hannah wrote, "I don't make a good picture. Yet, this is a very striking portrait. Hannah is wearing a black dress with white half sleeves and a black shawl draped across her shoulders. It is likely that she's wearing black because she's in mourning for her father. Her ringlets, her hair in ringlets is pulled back from her forehead. Hannah's hands are crossed in front of her, and it looks as if her fingers are entwined. On her wrists, she wears what appears to be black bands. Her gaze shows serenity and self-possession. She's not smiling, but there is a hint of resolute sadness, I think, in her face. And based on how she presents herself, it is clear that Hannah was interested in fashion. She shared this with her brother Walt. They both had a keen awareness of the effect of dress on oneself and others. Hannah resembled both her mother and her brother, Walt. "Mother, as I grow older," she writes, "I can see I look like you. Often when I am fixing my hair, I think how much I begin to look like you," she writes. Louisa Van Velser Whitman was Hannah's most trusted correspondent. A study of Louisa's portrait in the middle of the slide here reveals that Hannah inherited many of her mother's physical features: her gray eyes, the gentleness of her demeanor, and the contours of her face. These are all also similar to those of her older brother Walt. In the right-hand side of your screen, you see there Walt at about the same time. This daguerreotype was taken at about the same time as Hannah's in the mid-1850s, right around the time when Whitman is preparing his first edition of Leaves of Grass. So after her, there's another daguerreotype of Whitman at about the same time. I wanted you to see the resemblances between Hannah and her brother Walt. But after her marriage, Walt consistently sent Hannah small amounts of money. "I never in my life see anybody so good and have so much patience with me as Walt does," Hannah wrote to her mother in 1867. "I don't know what makes him so good. It's the kindness I care for. The affection that Hannah and Walt felt for each other is quickly apparent to the reader of their correspondence. In many of her letters, Hannah expresses concern for Walt's health, and the evidence of remaining correspondence suggests that he continued to write to her once or twice a week after their mother's death in 1873 and until his death in 1892. So up until 1873, Louisa was her most important correspondent, and then after that, it was Walt. In fact, the last letter that Walt Whitman wrote, dated March 17th, 1892, was addressed to Hannah. Unable to write much, Whitman notes, your good letter received, $4 enclosed. God bless you, W.W. He loved to send her little bits of money. He also sent her all the editions of Leaves of Grass when they were published. This on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see the cover of the first edition of Leaves of Grass, which was published in 1855. So he kept in touch with her, mostly through letters, and visited her briefly in Burlington in June of 1872 after he had presented the commencement address at Dartmouth. So he actually went up to Vermont once and visited her there. Louisa, his mother, always hoped that Walt Whitman would move up there, but Walt Whitman was not a person who would be interested in living in Vermont. He loved the city, so he very much wanted to stay near New York, and really didn't have any interest in moving up to Vermont at all, despite his mother's wishes. So Hannah knew, though, that she could count on Whitman, on Walt, and he never failed her. He always sent her small amounts of money in all of his later correspondence, which I've looked at, all the letters that he wrote to her. He would always enclose $2 to $4, sometimes more. He would send her recent copies of newspapers so she could read. And he always usually wrote sometimes on small pieces of paper because paper was expensive at this time, or he would send her a postcard. He was never wealthy, but he enriched her life with his support and with these letters and postcards and packages that he always sent to her, and his steady concern for her well-being. Because I'm from a large family, I'm interested in sibling relationships, and I think my relationships with my siblings in some ways allows me to have some insight into these sibling relationships. There were 8 living Whitman siblings, and they all corresponded with each other in these years, as well as Mother Whitman. So here's an image of Charles Louis Heyde, her husband. This is probably from the latter part of his life, but there's also one of his landscape paintings so that you can see what his artistry was like. She married him on March 16th of 1852. It's possible that Walt introduced Hannah to Heyde, although I'm sure that Walt later came to regret that. One of Charles's biographers writes that Heyde was impressed with the beauty of Whitman's slight, gray-eyed sister, Hannah. From what I can find, Hannah was about 5'6", and she weighed about 110 pounds. That's from the research I've done on her. And she remained slender all of her life because I think she suffered tremendously, not only from the abuse of Charlie, but also I think she experienced endometriosis before it was diagnosed as endometriosis. So after their marriage, Charlie and Hannah used Burlington, Vermont as their home base, but they traveled all over Vermont because Charlie would hike to a vantage point and sketch a scene for a painting. They would take the newly built railroad lines in Vermont. The railroad went in Vermont in the mid-1850s. And so he would take these railroad lines and sketch a scene, and then they would go to a boarding house or a hotel. They did this for about 12 years. They paid for their room and board at these boarding houses by selling his paintings. And then later they purchased a house in 1864 in Burlington. But it was a transient lifestyle, and it really impeded Hannah's ability to make close friendships. There's really no indication in her letters that she was able to achieve any kind of close emotional connectedness of deep friendship in all of the places that she lived. And this was partly because she was raised in a working class family. She was not as socially adept as Charlie was. Charlie was very verbally articulate from what I can see and from my understanding of his personality. So even though Hannah was educated and she had been a school teacher for a while in Long Island, she wasn't very comfortable with communal exchanges and dialogues and conversations that were expected at the boarding houses. It was Charlie who was the most conversational and who very much controlled the narrative of how others perceived him and her. He also struggled to earn a living because Americans' taste for painting was changing in the mid-19th century. As photography took hold, Americans moved away from purchasing landscape paintings in particular. Because of these struggles, well, for many reasons perhaps, but he began to drink, as we know, and later became an alcoholic. And his appearance became, as one critic notes, slovenly. So after he began abusing Hannah, he engaged in a letter writing campaign of his own. I've read his letters. Many of them are at Duke University. So he engaged in a letter writing campaign of his own. And in his letters, his strategy was similar to the strategy that he employed in Vermont. He reported that Hannah was lazy, that she was sloppy, and that he was forced to take care of her. These letters, of course, were a source of pain to Hannah. She did not know really specifically what Charlie wrote. She only knew that he did write. And she told her mother that she felt humiliated by these letters. And also humiliated that he would be troubling her family with details about their marriage. There's not the slightest truth in what he says or writes when he is angry, Hannah writes. He's sometimes very violent. Remember, don't believe anything he writes, she says. After he would read the letters that she received from her family, he would become very violent and angry. And so this motivated Hannah to dispose of these letters, unfortunately. So we don't have a lot of the letters that she received from her mother or from Walt or from her brothers or from her sister, Mary Elizabeth. She had an older sister named Mary Elizabeth. Many of the letters thus have been destroyed or lost, some by Hannah herself. For instance, in spring 1856, she writes, "I had just received and was reading your letter as Charlie came in to dinner. Charlie has not felt good-natured today. When he read your letter," she writes to her mother, "he appeared quite angry. He talks so singular when he is angry. I feel so much afraid." This was 1856, about 4 years after they were married. Several times, Hannah asked her mother to destroy the letters that Hannah wrote to her mother. "I know this is very silly," she writes, "but I should depend certainly upon no one seeing this letter but you, and upon your destroying it at once. I could say much, but I think it's very bad for me to tell or speak to you of disagreeable things," Hannah writes, 1859. Nevertheless, Mother Whitman kept the letters, and the letters survived primarily because Mother Whitman and Walt saved the letters that Hannah had sent to them. So Hannah's correspondence, and I've read all of these biographies of Whitman, Hannah's correspondence provides us with deeper insight into the status of women in the United States and into how domestic violence was understood during the 19th century. The understanding approaches to domestic violence allows us to contextualize Hannah's situation and also allows us to understand previously published biographical studies of Walt Whitman and his family. All of the biographies start with Whitman's family. For the most part, Whitman's biographers have blamed Hannah for the abuse that she suffered and included criticism of her supposed lack of domestic skills. I suspect because they had mostly read Charlie's letters, which were more available to them than Hannah's letters. In most instances, the seriousness and the complexity of Hannah's situation has been misconstrued by Whitman's biographers. Justin Kaplan dismisses Hannah as psychotic. David Reynolds reports that she was neurotic, that she dressed carelessly, and that she never learned to cook. Also, that she kept a messy house. Jerome Loving concludes that Hannah was a hypochondriac caught up in a bad marriage. And perhaps the most influential biography of Whitman, Gay Wilson Allen's biography published in 1855, and still the best biography of Whitman, written by Gay Wilson Allen, he concludes, and he's this was published in 1955, he concludes that Hannah secretly enjoyed her misery. Subsequent letters, he writes, were to reveal an unmistakable masochistic tendency. So as counter testimony to these portrayals, Hannah's correspondence with her mother and with her brother reveals a chilling, ongoing pattern of abuse beginning in the years shortly after her marriage. She writes, "I feel I don't deserve the treatment I get." She wrote this to her brother Walt in 1879. So in this collection of letters, for the first time, readers are provided with an alternative perspective to the biographer's perspective. And that perspective is Hannah's. She describes her living conditions, what happens to her, and how she responds to Heide's behaviors. The evidence in the correspondence records the repeated abuse that she suffered. Many of her letters were written surreptitiously. She had to write them secretly because Heyde was surveilling her, and he was surveilling her correspondence. He couldn't, of course, surveil everything, so she was able to get many letters off to her family. In some instances, and you can tell from the handwriting, this letter is written in pencil because she didn't have enough money to buy ink. In some instances, she had to write her letters quickly, and she had to bring them to the post office without Heide's knowledge. In those days, you had to go to the post office to mail a letter. So in addition to controlling her behavior through surveillance of the letters that she wrote, sometimes he would intercept the letters that she received from her family. Part of his reasoning for doing that was because he wanted to take any of the funds that they would send to her. So if they were enclosing money in these envelopes, he would confiscate the money. He would take the newspapers that were sent to her, or even the editions of Leaves of Grass. Unfortunately, he would take those. Of course, he wasn't able to get everything. So some of the letters did arrive intact, and she was able to read them. Some of her letters were written and posted without his perusal. But his oversight and the threat of his oversight compelled her to write secretly and at times hurriedly. Before posting them, though, I can tell that she reread them because she would add words or sentences in between the lines. You can't see that in this letter, but she would add words or sentences in between the lines, or she would write something at the end of the letter upside down, or she would write upside down at the top of the page or in the margins. And this is because paper was very expensive, and she wouldn't have had time to recopy her letters anyway. So she would be writing very hurriedly. I see a lot of smudges when she does use ink. Some of them suggest that she may have been crying when she wrote. And so I've highlighted what I think is a teardrop that has stained one of the pages. And I can't take complete credit for this. One of my students who helped me on this project, one of my undergraduate students at Pepperdine, noticed this teardrop, which I'm very grateful to her for doing that. So her decision to remain with Heyde after the abuse began was complicated. In their case, they were entangled through the bonds of marriage. It was very difficult to divorce in the 19th century. So they shared a union that the justice system deemed virtually undissolvable. Her experience of violence was complicated by the fact that Heyde was her cohabiting partner. Although he didn't share living space with her always, he often stayed in his studio, which he rented. It was also complicated by custom. The communities that they lived in perceived them as a married couple and could often hear the abuse, could hear the loud voices. And again, Heidi was controlling the narrative, so would report that Hannah was difficult and was arguing, and by their shared lives and experiences. Over time, it became more difficult for Hannah to extricate herself, and she didn't have the funds to do so. She did not work. She bore the brunt of the blame for the violence rather than Charlie in the communities in which they lived. After one abusive episode, Hannah writes, "It made some talk about the hotel. I have to bear the blame," she writes. Victims of intimate partner violence are often condemned as if they were the cause of the violence and as if they were asking for the abuse. So the episodes of abuse that Hannah reports in her letters sickened her mother and angered her brothers. She reports assault. She reports violent outbursts. She reports strangulation. She reports that she was pushed over chairs, that items were thrown at her, that treasured belongings were broken or burned or confiscated, and that there was almost constant demeaning and insulting verbal criticism. When I had a small group of undergraduate students helping me on this project, and some of them could hardly read the letters, they were so upset by what they read. And you can imagine how her family must have felt and how her mother and brothers must have felt after reading these testimonies. Hannah had no economic resources. She was isolated in Vermont, and Heidi would not even give her access to small funds so that she could purchase ink to write the letters with. As experts note, there are countless reasons why a woman stays with a violent partner. Women and their abusive partners have an interwoven, complex life together that is not easy to walk away from, financially or emotionally, especially at this time. Hannah did think of leaving her husband, but her financial situation gave her pause. "I don't know how or what I should do to support myself without him," she writes. She had no community support network, and so she's in this situation. What does she have? She has her letters. Elaine Foreman Crane, writing more generally of the way women coped with domestic violence in 19th century America, notes that these women relied on family members because this represented a less public confrontation than going to the sheriff, to the judge, or to town officials who would put family disputes on the back burner, leaving the woman to struggle with a husband who would have been even angrier at his wife's supposed defection and his public denunciations. It's really nowhere for women to go at this time, aside from friends and family members. And Hannah had neither of those in close proximity. What she had was her often pencil and a piece of paper. So these letters represented for her a less public confrontation and provided her with a safe space to document what was happening to her. The Whitman family, for their part, did formulate plans to extricate her, but they were ultimately unable to intervene. Mother Whitman herself, after her husband's death, this was prior to Social Security, was pretty much living hand to mouth. She didn't really have a place. Her sons and her children were supporting her. She was living with sons from time to time, had no income. So Hannah really, where could she go? And also her health was very fragile. Her family members were not able to travel to Vermont, except her mother did go once, and Walt did visit her once, but they just didn't have any idea where she could live and who could support her. So that was her situation. Now what I'd like to do is just focus very briefly on one of Whitman's poems so that we can begin to see how Hannah may have influenced Whitman's sensibility when it comes to writing his poetry. So if you'll just turn your attention to this poem, and I will try to make some connections for you so you can see what Whitman is doing here. His insights, Whitman's insights about sexuality and gender identity and relationships between men and women, as well as his ideas about American womanhood, were partly inflected by his relationship with Hannah. Various poems and passages in his poetry, in his book of poems known as Leaves of Grass, may have been influenced by his awareness of her situation and his concern for her. So I'd like to look specifically at this section of Song of Myself, his masterpiece, perhaps one of the great masterpieces of American literature. This is section 11. And in this section, he describes a lonesome, isolated woman. This telling sequence may be considered a description of how Walt imagined his sister's life could be, even as he knew how unhappy and lonely she was. While he could not extricate her from her marriage, he could imagine her escaping her situation in other ways. So with your patience, I'm going to read this passage to you, and then I'll say a few words about it. 28 young men bathed by the shore. 28 young men, and all so friendly. 28 years of womanly life, and all so lonely. She owns the fine house by the rise of the bank. She hides, handsome and richly dressed, aft the blinds of the window. Which of the young men does she like the best? Ah, the homeliest of them is beautiful to her. Where are you off to, lady? For I see you. You splash in the water, yet stay stock still in your room. Dancing and laughing along the beach came the 29th bather. The rest did not see her, but she saw them and loved them. The beards of the young men glistened with wet. It ran from their long hair. Little streams passed all over their bodies. An unseen hand also passed over their bodies. It descended tremblingly from their temples and ribs. The young men float on their backs. Their white bellies swell to the sun. They do not ask who seizes fast to them. They do not know who puffs and declines with pendant and bending arch. They do not think whom they souse with spray. The opening lines, the opening 3 lines of this passage are the key to understanding the rest of the section. The repetition of 28 captures the contrast that Whitman is drawing between the many, the young men, and the one, the young woman. The number's significance lies in identifying the age of the woman who observes, rather than the specific number of young men. Hannah was born on November 28th, and she married Charlie when she was 28 years old. In many of her letters home, Hannah describes the lake shore of Burlington and the boarding houses where she spent her days and nights. She mentions how deeply lonely she feels, isolated and far from home, as Charlie leaves her alone for long hours while he's away sketching and painting in his rented studio. Unlike the woman in the poem, Hannah was not wealthy, but she dressed well, and Walt could imagine her looking out the window at the young men from one of the boarding houses where the Heydes stayed. For a brief moment, Hannah becomes the 29th bather, and Walt liberates his sister from her lonely existence. She becomes liberated in his verse in a way that she could never be in her life. So that's my reading of that passage. It's a little bit longer in the book, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how Hannah is present in Whitman's verse. And I believe there are so many passages where this kind of reading could be done, and hopeful that other Whitman scholars will pursue those passages. I'm gonna put this onto the next slide, if I can do that. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay. I wanted you to see not just Louisa again, but also that lovely portrait, that daguerreotype of Walt Whitman. This is right before he went to the Civil War hospitals, and then, of course, one of my favorite libraries in the world, the Library of Congress, because it has so much of Whitman's papers in it in Washington, D.C., but also where many of Hannah's letters are. So Mother Whitman was living in New York and in the proximity to New York, while Walt Whitman lived in Washington, D.C. from 1863 to 1874. So it's Mother Whitman who really saved the letters that were addressed to her from Hannah, even though Hannah asked her to destroy them. Hannah's letters to both Mother Whitman and to Walt are mixed in with each other in the largest collection of her letters, known as the Hannah Louisa Whitman Heyde Papers at the Library of Congress, which suggests that Walt was probably the last family member to own this collection of Hannah's letters, because Mother Whitman died in 1873, Walt died in 1892, and then the people who inherited his estate, I can say more about that if you're interested, also became owners of these letters. What I did was I went to the Library of Congress and I took pictures of all the letters, and I put them in what I perceive to be a chronological sequence, beginning with Hannah's arrival in Vermont in 1852 and ending with her last letter to Mrs. Romana Samus of the Huntington, Long Island Historical Society. This is the house where Whitman was born. There was some dispute about that. So Mrs. Samus wrote to Hannah, who was the only surviving sibling at the time, and said, "Is this where Whitman was born?" And Hannah confirmed that it was. I located this letter in the vault at the Walt Whitman birthplace house in Long Island, which I have visited several times, much to my joy, to see the house where Whitman was born and spent some of his childhood. The challenge was that although Hannah often included her location in her letters, she didn't put the date on her letters in most of them. So it was difficult to understand the chronology. I had to do a lot of digging and figuring out, oh, okay, so she was in Burlington. She was in a different part of Vermont at this time. So I put them in a roughly chronological sequence. I've also looked at her handwriting and studied it to see what the changes were over time. So while she included her location, she didn't include the date very often in her letters. But if you look at this collection, you'll see that I have dated the letters for you and have put them into a chronology over the time period. And this is the most complete collection of her letters. There may be others out there. I haven't uncovered them. I would love to find another letter, but these are all of her letters as far as we know. So how did she survive? She survived because she developed tactics. She developed tactics to avoid complete debilitation. Her connection to her family provided her with strength, and without close support networks or friendships, she really had to cultivate strategies. Her letters were the one place where she could write about the ongoing trauma in her life and where she could expect unconditional love and attentive care in return. And she did get that. This is one of the letters that I uncovered in the Library of Congress that, as you can see, was written on May 18th, 1863. Walt Whitman did date his letters, thankfully. Another thing you'll notice about this letter, above the place, which is Washington, D.C., you'll see a little parenthetical aside from Whitman to his sister. He writes, George's letter, George was another brother, got rather torn, but you can make it out. So what the Whitman siblings and Louisa, the Mother Whitman, would do is put other siblings' letters inside their letter so they could all read the letters. So he must have put one of George's letters inside this letter to Hannah. So I wanted you to see how that network could work. So with this collection, for the first time, readers have access to the same information that the Whitman family had access to. And we can now understand why the Whitman family, particularly Walt and his mother, were so concerned about Hannah. Almost every letter they write to each other, have you heard from Hannah? I haven't heard from Hannah. I'm worried about Hannah. Why they were so concerned about her, those questions can be answered by reading through these letters. So her story has at last been told from her perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mullins. So insightful. Again, it's like we had talked earlier about it being a mystery, and we get to kind of peer inside who said what and who thought what and who was on this side and who was on that side. So I appreciate all the work that you have done and uncovering, putting items in chronological order. I would love for you to share with the group what you told me about when you visited the Library of Congress and saw that collection of Hannah's letters and just the array of it and kind of what state it was in.
Well, it's an interesting story. Thank you, Vanessa, for bringing that up. I had the great good fortune through several travel funds to be able to go to conferences in Washington, D.C., which I love because it's right near the Library of Congress, and also because I just love that city. But when I went to the Library of Congress, I came across this collection of her letters. And as I looked at them, the handwritten letters, they were disheveled. And what I realized is that probably previous Whitman scholars had been looking at her letters too. David Reynolds, Jerome Loving, Gay Wilson Allen definitely read through her letters, but there was some dishevelment. And so I thought, these letters really do need to be honored and put back together. So I just took pictures of them as they were in the folder. And then I went back and looked at the digital images and tried to put pages with letters, scraps and fragments with letters that they belong to. Honestly, it was like a puzzle to get the letters in the proper order. Some of the pages had been moved into different parts of the folder. There are 63 letters, and not all of them are at the Library of Congress, but you can just imagine what a kind of a disheveled state they were in. So not only to put them into their proper order, but then to transcribe them and edit them and annotate them, I felt was a great honor. I felt that, in a sense, Hannah was, I know this sounds weird, but Hannah was speaking through me. And I really had to work hard to get this collection published. I must have sent it out to 20 presses, but I finally found the right editor, and she said, we want to do this. We want to publish this. So that day was perhaps one of the most joyous days of my life as a Whitman scholar, when I found out that Bucknell was going to publish this collection. And I was happy not for me, I was happy for Hannah. So that's the story.
Thank you, and congratulations.
Thank
and
you.
Thank you for telling her story. If others in the group have a question, you can unmute yourself. I'm going to start with a couple that are in the chat. So if you do have a question that you'd like to drop in the chat, we can put those forward as well. Thank you so much for reading a snippet of Walt's work and kind of overlaying that with your thoughts on how that describes his view of maybe his sister's escapement, if you will, from her life. There's a question about if there are other feminist readings of Walt Whitman's work.
Yes, there are. Vivian Pollock also wrote about this section 11 of Song of Myself, and identified Hannah as the 29th bather. I want to give her credit for that. She has done a very good job of providing a feminist reading of Whitman's work. The other person who comes to mind is Sherry Saniza. She has done a very good job of writing and providing context for Whitman's interactions with outspoken women of his time, like Fanny Fern and some other women who were speaking out in his time. He was very much interested in that. So Sherry Saniza, Ceniza, and Vivian Pollock, Pollak. But to be honest with you, there haven't been that many feminist readings of his work. Also, your point about sleepers, his poem, The Sleepers, is exactly right. Very much evident, especially that section where he becomes the woman, the female sleeper. I think he's thinking of Hannah there, but there are other sections in that poem, I think, that could easily be read through this lens, Bridget. So good insight there about his very beautiful poem called The Sleepers.
Another question in the chat is, do you find any reference in her letters to God or nature? Or is there any sense of her values? Was she perhaps a humanist? There.
She does not talk about God in her letters. She does talk about nature. She talks about the seasons. She talks about her garden. She talks about what she's cooking. She makes pies sometimes, or she's working in the kitchen. I do think that this may be related to the way that the Whitman family was raised. As you could tell from her portrait, Mother Whitman wore a Quaker cap, Quaker-ish cap. Her mother was a Quaker, but Louisa did not attend any church. Some of the children were educated and did go to Sunday school at what we would call an Episcopal church in New York. And while there are what, our understanding right now is more spiritual rather than strictly religious. The only sibling that might have been considered religious and who attended Sunday service was the youngest sibling, Eddie, who lived with Mother Whitman. Eddie was developmentally disabled and ultimately had to be committed after Mother Whitman died because no one could take care of him. But he was the only sibling, the youngest sibling. He was the only one who attended any kind of church service regularly.
Another question is about the campaign that Charles put forward to cast Hannah in a certain light. Do you have any sense of how he disseminated that information? I mean, it's widely spread. It's noted in most of Whitman's biographies. How was that? How did he go about that in that?
He was very crafty. Well, he wanted to preserve his reputation. And he was concerned, I think, I'm trying to understand what his motivation was. He wanted to preserve his reputation as an artist. So that is partly why he wrote The Whitman Family, because Walt was involved in many circles in Manhattan of other like-minded artists. And of course, he didn't want Walt to have the impression that he was abusing Walt's sister. So that was part of his reason for that letter campaign. But within the community, I can discern what he did because Hannah reports that at least 2 people said something to her about what Charlie was doing. One of them was a hotel owner. He came up to Hannah at one point. Hannah writes about this in one of her letters, and he says, "How are you?" And Hannah said, "I'm good. Why?" And he said, "Because I'm concerned. I knew what was going on. We all knew what was going on." And she said, "How did you know?" And he said, "We could hear it." So that there was community knowledge, but Charles put it off on her. And this hotel owner knew what was going on. But it was the culture. It, as you could see, the justice system, the support system in the community, domestic violence shelters didn't really become part of American life until the 1970s. So there was really nowhere for Hannah or other abused women to go at this time. But Charlie was very crafty, and he had his friends, he had his admirers of his work, and it was very socially acceptable for him to blame Hannah for the abuse. So I hope that answers that question.
And you had mentioned that when he would intercept Hannah's letters, he would take out the letter altogether or anything that was added in that letter, including the money. Do you sense that was more of a punishment or more of a need for those funds that perhaps Walt sent along?
Good question. I think it was both. Yeah. Both a punishment and a need. He was, especially toward the end of his life, they were really struggling to pay their property taxes on their house. So he was continually asking Walt for funds And in fact, in Walt Whitman's will, he specifically left Hannah $1,000 and he specifically left Charlie $100. So he really wanted Hannah to have the money, not Charlie.
And in another talk you gave, I heard you mention there was only one time that probably Whitman spoke ill about Heidi. Would you go into that snake reference, perhaps?
Oh my goodness, you're so right. And I didn't bring it up here. But Charlie was probably the only person that I know of that could really make Walt Whitman angry. And in some of his correspondence and some of his statements to his literary biographer, Horace Traubel, Whitman described Charlie as a snake. He also said he was a bed bug and used other epithets to describe him. So yeah, one of the rare instances where Walt Whitman really would lose his temper was when it came to Charlie. And it was, of course, because Whitman knew what was happening with his sister.
We know, or if you know, where Hannah is buried, and perhaps if you have visited her grave.
Yes. She thankfully is not buried with Charlie. I visited his grave. I found it in Vermont. He's buried in Lakeview Cemetery, about 10 miles outside of Burlington. He has a little plaque on his grave. If anyone's interested, I can send you a picture of it. But Hannah's not buried there. She's buried in the Whitman family tomb in New Jersey. Whitman put up a lot of money to fund a huge tomb. If you're interested, it's in the Harley Cemetery near Camden, New Jersey, where he died. And Hannah is there. She's interred there with the rest of the family members and with Walt, with his mother and his father. And Bridget and I visited that cemetery, and it is a lovely spot there in Camden, New Jersey. It's just a gorgeous setting for Whitman and his family. And I'm glad Hannah's there with her family, finally at last. Yeah.
I want to share a comment from the chat from Connie from Pepperdine. Thank you. Just pointing to the fact that women were considered property and childlike, needing to be corrected, often by beatings, and that she assumed this was true in the 1850s to 1890s. And I would venture some continue to have that point of view.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's unfortunate the way the legal system at this time viewed women, but also the way the culture viewed women. They weren't considered fully human, did not have the right to vote, of course, so had no voice in any kind of legislation. And if there were to be any sort of action taken, it was always usually the husband's word over the wife's word. When it came to divorce, children were always awarded to the father, not to the mother. So there were the judicial and divorce had to be public. It came before a judge. It was not easily attained at this time. So just the way women were viewed and treated, just appalling. In Louisiana, the term was under my thumb. You had the right to have a stick. What the width, the thickness of your thumb to be able to hit your wife with that. So it was normalized. Violence was normalized. Anger was normalized, and women could not strike back or be angry in any way because they would be punished for that. It then would be all their fault that they had provoked their husband. So it's just a very sad and troubling and difficult time for women who found themselves in these abusive relationships, sometimes tied to alcoholism as well.
And I appreciate that you mentioned the tactics that Hannah took to help avoid her demise altogether, that being her family and her letters. And I can't imagine, you had mentioned that she had only got to see her family, Walt and her mother once or twice within the time of her marriage. So to lean on letters or to transcribe these feelings and send those back and forth, it must have meant the world to her.
It really did. And I just want to say one last thing. George Washington Whitman, who was the fourth brother in the line, was actually one of Hannah's favorites. And George wrote a lot of letters. And in one of his letters, he served in many campaigns in the Civil War. He was a soldier. He was wounded. He was taken prisoner. He managed to survive the Civil War miraculously. But he wrote in one of his letters to Mother Whitman that he felt that Hannah suffered more than he ever suffered as a soldier in the Civil War, as a wounded soldier in the Civil War, and as a prisoner in the Civil War, that he felt that she suffered more than he did. And I think that shows you the level of empathy and sympathy that these siblings had for each other, that he cared so deep, George cared so deeply for Hannah that he felt her pain and her suffering and could see it through the lens of his own pain and suffering as a soldier.
That's very poignant. You had also mentioned that her mother was her most trusted correspondent. Is that because of the consistency of her letters, or the sheer nature of being a mother, kind of social protector? What led you to kind of term her in that most trusted?
I could see early on in reading these letters, because most of them are addressed to her mother, that in some ways Louisa was Hannah's confidant, that she felt she could entrust Louisa with her experiences. But Mother Whitman, as they all called her, Mother Whitman was really the locus for the siblings. Wherever she was where they all wanted to be. So she lived with Jeff, one of the brothers, for a while. They would all go there. Then she didn't want to go live with George, but she ultimately did go live with George, and that's where she died. And that then became the locus for the family.
And if I'm correct, was it Charles who passed away first? And if so, then what did Hannah have other than the $1,000 that was left to her by Walt?
I think George was funding her. George became wealthy after the Civil War. He did not have children, but he did marry, and he went into pipe fitting in Camden. And after he died, I forget what year he died, he left Hannah a trust fund. And in today's money, that trust fund would have been worth about $150,000 a year. And she got that trust fund after Charlie died, thankfully. He died in 1892. I can't remember when George died. So Charlie died roughly around the same time as Walt Whitman, which would have cut her off from any funds. And of course, this is before Social Security. So fortunately, George helped her. She died. She was the last sibling to die. She died in 1908.
Amazing, thinking everything that she had endured and that she was the last to remain, even though she was not the youngest.
That's right. That's right. She was the fourth child, but she did manage to survive.
And there are many Mullen researchers here. So Bridget added to our chat that the Violence Against Women Act was not passed until 1992. So a long time. And I know that just because that was passed, we still see that today. But I know that Hannah's story is unfortunately not unique. But her place in history and being related to Walt Whitman gives us the opportunity to look into her life. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to say anything further about kind of the spotlight that is put on Hannah, but how that relates to us globally.
Well, I think the situation of women in the United States and globally right now, especially with what's happening in Iran and the protests, we can see that the treatment of women says so much about a particular culture and about a particular environment. We do know that in places where women are treated well and educated, everyone thrives. In places where women are not treated well and not allowed to have access to education or other venues, the society does not thrive. So it seems to be one of the linchpins for a flourishing, a human flourishing. Hannah did not have children. I see that question in the chat. And this also, I think, was an ongoing source of perhaps conflict between Charlie and Hannah, because women were expected to have children at this time. I believe she didn't have children because she was so mistreated, but also because of the endometriosis that she suffered. I believe it was endometriosis. So,
well, from your lips to the world's leadership ears, we support you in that fact and that calling for education and advancement for all beings, which including women. So. Thank you so much for your time, your research, your heart. When you had mentioned that you were telling Hannah's story through yourself, I can sense how important this work is to not only represent her, but to represent culture and time and women. So I applaud you and I thank you for putting this talk together and sharing it with us today. So thank you, Dr. Mullins.
Thank you, Vanessa. I really appreciate this opportunity to share Hannah's story whenever I can, and especially this opportunity. Thank you.